The chamber was a furnace of tension, the air, thick with anticipation, rippled with the low hum of whispered conversations and shifting papers. Cameras clicked like distant thunder. Lights, too bright and unforgiving, bleached the color from the mahogany furniture and cast sharp angles across the seated figures. At the heart of the room, two women sat on opposite sides of a long, polished desk. Their gazes locked like flint and steel, one spark away from fire. Karoline Leavitt adjusted the collar of her blazer, its crisp white lapels framed against a blood-red blouse, the same shade as her lipstick, meticulously applied to project confidence, strength, and command. She was used to being underestimated, and she'd made a career out of defying expectations. At just 30, she was already a rising star in conservative media and had recently taken a role as communications director for a high-profile Congressional committee. She came from the small town of Atkinson, New Hampshire, blue-collar roots, strict Catholic upbringing, and the kind of ambition that never let her sleep in. Her dream was simple: power, but not for power's sake. She wanted to steer the national conversation, to be the young voice of traditional values in a world that seemed to her to be spinning off its moral axis. But behind her composed smile and confident rhetoric was a gnawing fear that deep down she was still the girl who had to fight to be heard over her older brothers, who had to earn every inch of respect with perfect grades, polished speeches, and unshakable poise. She was tired, but she couldn't let it show. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman from Dallas, Texas, whose rise had been nothing short of meteoric. A former public defender, Jasmine had walked into politics with fire in her eyes and steel in her spine. Her background, forged in the heat of courtroom battles, community organizing, and protest lines, gave her a swagger that made traditional politicians bristle. She wore her curls natural and her tone unapologetic. Every word she spoke carried the weight of experience and the sting of unfiltered truth. Jasmine hadn't come to Washington to play nice. She came to dismantle the systems that silenced people who looked like her, people whose pain was routinely ignored. Her staff called her the storm in heels, because when she arrived, things moved. The hearing had begun civil enough, a standard review of federal funding allocations for community programs. But that civility lasted all of 7 minutes. Karoline, seated as a witness for her committee's media division, had launched into a prepared statement criticizing certain representatives, Jasmine among them, for using emotional manipulation and identity politics to deflect from policy failures. There it was, the spark. Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat back, letting Karoline's words echo into silence. Then she leaned forward slowly, her voice low, steady, and deadly clear. "Ms. Leavitt," Jasmine said, "you come in here with your prepared monologue and your talking points like you're auditioning for a Fox News primetime slot. But what you're doing is weaponizing your privilege and your access to cold lived experience manipulation. So let me ask you directly, how many mothers have you consoled after their child was shot in their own neighborhood? How many courtrooms have you stood in where the scales of justice weren't just tipped, they were bolted to the ground?" The chamber fell into silence. Not a shuffle, not a murmur. Karoline opened her mouth, then closed it. It was the briefest of hesitations, but it echoed like a dropped gavel. Her face, always composed, twitched slightly at the corner of her mouth, and in that micro-expression the truth escaped. She had nothing. The cameras captured it all, and by the next morning the internet had done its work. Hashtags exploded. Asterisk asterisk. Hash Jasmine drag asterisk asterisk. Asterisk asterisk. Speechless Karoline ***. TikToks dissected the exchange frame by frame. Pundits took sides. Her supporters said she was ambushed. Critics said she got exactly what she deserved. But behind the viral moment was a deeper unraveling. Karoline went home that night and stared at her bathroom mirror, scrubbing off the crimson lipstick that now felt like war paint she hadn't earned. She replayed the moment over and over, that flash of vulnerability, that inability to answer from the heart because her heart wasn't in the conversation. She'd always known how to debate facts, how to marshal data and craft persuasive narratives, but she'd never been trained, never allowed to feel publicly. Feelings were messy, dangerous. A woman who cried was a liability. A woman who raged was unhinged. So she'd learned to be polished. And in doing so, she'd become empty. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat on the steps of the Capitol, letting the warmth of the stone seep into her back. Her assistant handed her a phone. Viral again, he said with a grin. She sighed, brushing a curl from her face. Yeah, but this ain't the win. He frowned. It's not enough to clap back, she said. People think politics is a roast battle, but I didn't come here to get applause. I came here to move the needle. Back in Dallas, her office was drowning in calls, mothers thanking her, young women saying they saw themselves in her. But also threats, ugly, bone-deep threats from those who hated seeing a black woman speak with power. Jasmine carried it all because she'd learned that real leadership meant being a shield and a sword. As days passed, the story faded from headlines. But Karoline couldn't let it go. For the first time in her career, she'd lost control not of the narrative, but of herself. She tried to return to work, but the silence from colleagues spoke louder than any critique. Her mentors offered careful, political consolation, "You'll bounce back." But what if she didn't want to bounce back into the same person? That fall, Karoline disappeared from the press circuit. Rumors swirled. She was fired, she was regrouping, she was going on tour. None were true. She flew home to New Hampshire, back to the house with creaky floors and the smell of pine needles. Her mother, still sharp despite age and arthritis, hugged her without words. And that night, Karoline did something she hadn't done in years. She opened her childhood journal. Reading her teenage entries was like meeting a stranger, a girl who wanted to fight for underdogs, who'd once organized a fundraiser for a migrant family whose home had burned down, who cried over stories of injustice and swore she'd make a difference. She'd lost that girl. In the quiet of her childhood room, Karoline sat with the discomfort, the ache of self-betrayal. And for the first time, she let herself feel shame, not as a punishment, but as a teacher. The next chapter didn't come quickly or dramatically. It came slowly, like dawn through fog. Karoline began volunteering at a local community center. She met a young mother who had just aged out of foster care and was trying to get her GED. They talked every week. No cameras, no tweets. Just two women trying to figure out how to survive a system that didn't care much for either of them. She began writing again, not op-eds, but reflections, honest ones, about how ambition without empathy becomes cruelty, about the difference between being loud and being right. And slowly, she rebuilt a sense of self not crafted for the camera, but rooted in conviction. Months later, Jasmine was invited to a national symposium on women in leadership. She saw Karoline's name on the list of speakers and nearly skipped the event. But curiosity won. Karoline took the stage last. She spoke differently now. No more rhetorical flourishes. No pre-rehearsed jabs, just truth, I was taught to win arguments, she said, but I wasn't taught to listen, and that cost me more than a moment on camera. It cost me my direction. I owe thanks to the woman who challenged me not with insult, but with reality, and I've spent every day since trying to become the kind of leader who earns her voice, not just projects it. In the front row, Jasmine didn't clap. She nodded slow, measured, and afterward she walked up and extended her hand. No hard feelings, Jasmine said. None, Karoline replied, just hard lessons. They didn't become friends, that wasn't the point, but they did become something rarer, mutual mirrors. Women who had faced each other and walked away changed. The moment that went viral became less about humiliation and more about evolution. Because sometimes the most savage comeback isn't a line, it's a life redirected. And in that truth there's a lesson for all of us, that being speechless isn't always defeat. Sometimes it's the beginning of finally learning to speak.